is to analyze those things that are being impacted as a result of the new administration of President Trump. And in my last class, I sought to suggest to you all that the supporters of Donald Trump are not per se our enemy. And in fact, you know, not even the people who we talked about, those who are there, who does Donald Trump ultimately represent? Who do
the American people
say that Donald Trump ultimately represents?
I don't know the 1%.
Excuse me. Who said that?
Reginald Payne, accounting major. I believe we said like 1%.
The 1%, Mr. Payne. Thank you. You don't need to necessarily acknowledge yourself in terms of your major, although it's good to know. But the 1%. And again, we talked about how the 1%, how they have created, particularly the caste system in which we live, called, you know, white supremacy or racism, as a way of dividing the rest of the what? The rest of the 99%, right? And so that is a technique or ploy to manage, if you will, that 99%. However, when we were talking, I didn't want to give you the idea that it is a zero-sum game, meaning to say it's not them versus us necessarily. They may feel that way. That is, the 1% might feel that way. But ultimately, we know that, you know, particularly those who, you know, have a faith tradition, that no man or woman is inherently evil, right? Mm-hmm. And so our enemy is not, you know, the 1%. If we have an enemy, and of course, you know, for those who have a faith tradition, we understand that our only true enemy is who or what?
ourselves.
Excuse, who? Again, if you want to be acknowledged, you need to stand up and be acknowledged. What did you say, young lady?
The devil.
Exactly. The only true enemy is the devil, who's not even a human being, right? So again, we don't necessarily need to, again, lump Donald Trump, right, for those who believe that he is adversarial or against our interests. We don't necessarily need to lump him into the category of being our enemy, right? Our enemy is somebody who has no ability to basically be swayed to the other side, right? Now, he may be our adversary at the moment, right? But not necessarily, again, somebody who cannot be swayed, right, to the path, right, of correctness, if you will. You know what I mean? Oftentimes, in the faith tradition, the path of righteousness. We all know that there's a way in which to, and that's one of the things that we're teaching you all, particularly as business lawyers, as business managers, and as those who will be interacting in the business world, how to, you know, again, sway people to your position, right? That's one of the key things that we're going to be hoping to teach you how to do. So again, standing up and being acknowledged and talking in that way is the type of training that is laying down the foundation for you being able to communicate in that way. Does that make sense, everybody? All right, great. So let us continue here. Now, so in the, again, the class timeline, the schedule, we're going to be going over today Chapter 10, Employment, Immigration, and Diversity. And then we're going to talk about our venture competition. We discussed it a little bit last time, and we're going to do again that. And we won't have your first venture presentation. We're going to talk about a little bit more next class, too. But your first class venture presentation will not be due until 2/16. So you have a couple of weeks before that. All right, a couple of weeks to form your ventures and your teams, and actually get that first project together. All right. We'll next going to be going over next week the chapter 11 rather, which goes into a little bit more detail relating to employment discrimination and diversity, as well as administrative agencies. And I think particularly it's important to talk about the administrative agencies as a result of the fact that many on the federal level, many of the leaders of these administrative agencies are just now being approved by the Senate. And so we'll talk about how these administrative agencies on the federal level are going to be impacted, and how that is going to trickle down to the administrative agencies on the state level. All right. Next, we'll talk about go into actually the discussion about the development of business enterprises, starting from the simplest form of business, which is a sole proprietorship and franchise, which we discussed last class, into the partnerships and limited liability companies, which again are hybrids of partnerships and corporations. And then we'll talk about corporations and then other business forms. Then we'll get into chapter 4. We'll talk about a little bit more about not only corporate formation, but also financing and the mechanisms of financing your startups. And these are the types of things that, again, are going to be weighed in to your presentation. So each time there's a presentation, right, you all are going to be actually learning something in class and then going around and producing it, working on that which we learned in class in order to help build your company. So all the chapters that we are covering are designed to help prepare you for the creation of your venture that you are forming and you are going to be presenting at each class. But then the final presentation will be at the end of the class with a panel of judges, as we discussed last class, right? You have your midterm, you can hold. You'll have your a quiz before we go to chapters 1. You have a quiz coming up into not this next week, but the week after next. We'll have a quiz, and then on the 16th, which is a month later, you have the midterm. And again, you'll have homework generally every class except those that are going to be preceding your midterm evaluations. And I see that we have, except for this one, homework 5, chapter 4 questions. Generally, you won't have those preceding exams, but we had to get this one in because you'll have 10 homework assignments. 10 homework assignments in order for you to get your 10 points. So each homework assignment is going to be 1/10 of your overall points in order for you to get your full. And again, it's easy to get those 10 points. All you got to do is turn in your homework. And homework will always only be accepted by Blackboard. So there won't be any questions about, I submitted my homework, but you didn't record it. If you submit it, it'll be documented exactly what time you turned it in. All right. Also, again, after the spring break, we'll go and review the midterms, and we'll talk about now going into property. So again, every company is going to have some property, right? Either personal property, which includes, paper, pencils, any of the products that you're making, right? From again the basics of developing a concept to those things that you're selling. To then the next chapter, chapter 29, we'll go over real property, and again we'll talk about the distinction between personal property and real property. Real property is when we talk about land. Okay, we'll talk about again rights related to land. Then we'll go over wills and trusts. So at the end of life, right, which is again, when you form a company, hopefully one of the things you're doing is you're forming a company for the purpose of, passing on wealth from yourself to your children, right, or your spouses. So again, you want to be able to understand how you pass that on. How do you pass on stock? How do you pass on partnership, interests that you might have in your company, right? Also, one of the things we want to talk about is the whole idea of succession planning, right? So again, we're all humans, and we're CEOs, and one of us dies, and the CEO dies, and what happens? If we're the managers of our companies, and we become incapacitated, what happens? So these are the types of things that we'll be talking about as well in that chapter. And then after that, we're going to get into, so we'll have a quiz there as well. And then we're going to get into the whole idea of creditors' rights. The things that, again, if you have a company and someone owes you money, right, and they don't pay you, how do you go about collecting that money? Right? What are your rights as it relates to them, right? Then we're going to talk about what happens if you, again, are a company and you cannot pay your debts because the people have, let's say, for example, clients haven't paid you after, how can you basically prevent your company from collapsing by obtaining protection from your creditors through bankruptcy, right? Bankruptcy is in a concept of a shield that protects you from creditors. And then we'll talk about electronic banking and some of the things that, again, you might need to know, again, about electronic funds transfers. We'll talk about certificates of deposits. We'll talk about, things that relate to investments and how to protect yourself from fraudulent activity that might come about through the digital age. And then finally, we will have the final exam review and the venture presentations in our Shark Tank, week 16, and then the final exam. Does anybody have any questions about the revised course syllabus?
Can you speak on the venture presentation? This is my first day.
Sure, we'll talk about that later in the class.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Miss Lena?
Is the final exam will be proctor or something special?
It's going to be, again, a regular exam. One of the things I'm going to do is today, actually, Ms. Morgan, can I ask you to do me a favor? Well, actually, I'll probably do it. I'm going to, after our break, I'm going to come back with some copies of the midterm exam from last semester. And I want you all to take a look at this midterm exam and actually take it. Take it now,
Okay.
right? Just so you can get a sense of what types of things I'm asking of you. And you can also see where you are. So let me tell you, in law school, I always told my mentees, and generally you have, you create a mentor-mentee relationship. As a young student, you find mentors, and then once you go become a second-year law student, then you can now become a mentor for a first-year law student. But then one of the things I always told my mentees is that the first thing you want to do when you go into that class is to go and get a copy of the final exams that are generally on file. They used to be in the library, but now I'm sure they're digital. Get a copy of the final exam and take it the first day of class. In fact, even before you go on the first day of class. So then you'll know basically what is expected of you. And you'll see the types of things that the professor is seeking to test you on. And generally, you can almost be guaranteed that at least one, and in some cases more than one, of those questions are going to basically come up not just on the final exam, but perhaps in the midterm or even in the quizzes along the way. All right?
All right.
Is there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
With the homework, is there a certain time that you want them to be turned in, and are there a certain number of questions that you're going to have? And then with the final, is the final almost choice, like how is it going to be formatted?
Sure. and it's good that you're asking about the final exam so early, but you'll see a style of the final by taking a look at the midterm, all right? And I'm going to pass you around copies after the class. And in terms of homework will always be due before the next class meets. So class, we give you a homework assignment today, it'll be due, submitted before 4:55. That'll be the cutoff.
Okay.
And that'll be, again, documented in your homework assignment Dropbox that will be created for you to submit your homework, all right?
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right, great. So now let's turn to the chapter at hand, and that's chapter 10. What else I would like for you to do is, where's that sign-in sheet again? Make sure can you make sure that Miss Lena, excuse me, can you make sure Miss Lena,
I got it.
you did?
I had it in, I didn't know where it was.
Oh, you said what? Okay. Great.
What about the copy?
So this is, again, this is the sign-in sheet, not for attendance, because we've already taken attendance, but this is for class participation, all right? So what I want to do is now go over the class outline, and again, I'm not going to hold you guys to account too much today, because again, the information was given to you late. In fact, what I'll probably do is probably this purpose. We'll kind of give you all, everybody who came, class participation point for today, but I will ask you questions nevertheless. But let me start by, first of all, talking about the baseline, and that is immigration law. Now, because I'm sure we all probably heard about the changes in immigration policy that happened over the weekend. And in that case, as you may know, President Trump's administration declared that they were going to essentially not only build a wall, which he had announced, but he was going to essentially bar people from entering the country from seven countries on a temporary 120 days basis, but then was going to indefinitely suspend refugees or immigrants from Syria. So all refugees were from any place were suspended for 120 days, and then those from Syria were suspended indefinitely. And on top of that, people who were who actually had visas, who had already gone through the process of immigrating or already in the process of going to get their visitor's visa, and a visa is only an admission. So if anybody has ever traveled internationally, you know that you have to get a stamp on your passport. And that stamp on your passport is that which allows you to actually come from this country to go to another country. And so that stamp, right, which is called a visa, he declared that those visas were invalid for people from those seven countries. And it just so happened that the seven countries that he targeted were Muslim countries. And then he made statements that the people who were from those countries who were not Muslim would be able to come in, but the people who were Muslims would not be able to come in. And we know that, and we'll talk a little bit about, again, the constitutionality of these things in the next class, but we do know, and we'll talk a little bit about it also here as well, that the Constitution provides that there should be no establishment of one religion over the other. So by identifying one religion as those that would be singled out, he, in many ways, scholars have suggested, is in violation of the First Amendment Establishment Clause. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the class. So again, but the overall idea that I want to start off with is to at least let you know what is immigration. How do we how do we control our borders? One of the things that President Trump has said, that there can be no nation without national borders, right? Without a definition of what distinguishes us from Canada and us from Mexico. Those are the two countries that border the United States, at least in the context of this landmass. Now, we also have land outside of the mainland, for example, Alaska, right? And then we know that that in Alaska, our neighbor is who? Canada, and who else? Russia. Again, make sure that you stand in order to answer the question. But nevertheless, that's correct. Russia and Canada are our neighbors there. All right. So again, so in essence, he's correct in that we do need to have national borders, right? But the question is whether or not those borders have been adequately protected, and whether or not these new laws or new policies are making the borders more or less defined and making the people in the United States more or less safe. So we'll talk a little bit about that, all right? Okay. So the idea of governing immigration comes from what act? What act governs immigration here in this country? Who's that?
Immigration Reform.
Exactly, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, right? Immigration Control and Reform Act prohibits hiring or recruiting people who have come into this country illegally, right? Also known as illegal immigrants. It also requires employers to complete a Form I-9 for each employee that verifies that they are either a U.S. citizen or otherwise entitled to work in the United States. How many of us have, remember the I-9 form that we've completed when we started our jobs, right? Everybody, I'm sure, might have jobs, right? Hopefully you would have completed that. And they also, Immigration Reform and Control Act, also prohibits employment discrimination on the basis that the person might be an illegal immigrant, right? So you can't go up to somebody who's speaking Spanish, right, as an employer and say, I'm not going to hire you. I'm not going to hire you because you may be an illegal immigrant. You cannot make that claim, or you can't take that action against them unless what? Mr. Momo?
You have proof.
You have proof, and you know that they're an illegal immigrant, right? Because sometimes people basically will take action and say, well, I'm not being racist. I'm actually just trying to avoid hiring illegal immigrants. It's called in the law a pretext. They're using a lawful reason to justify an unlawful action, right? Their action is, we know, their unlawful intention, that is. Their unlawful intention in that case is to basically discriminate against, let's say, people who are Latinos, right? And they use an idea of trying to prevent or avoid running afoul of the law by not wanting to hire, again, people who are unlawfully here in the United States. So they say, well, I can't hire you because you're illegal without even conducting the verification through the Form I-9. So that's, again, one thing to be aware of. An employer will violate the Immigration Reform and Control Act if they hire someone not entitled to work and knows or should know. So if you hire somebody and you don't know, right? You reasonably don't know that this person, is not authorized. And I don't like to use the word illegal because it's almost kind of, again, it's derogatory. It's derogatory, right? Who's illegal? Some would argue. Particularly those of people who are of Mexico. But Mexicans, they would say, well, this was once our land. You know what I mean? In many cases, right? Especially that part of Texas and parts of California, right? And New Mexico, I think, right? So again, we don't want to use that terminology from the context of the law. But nevertheless, so if the person, when all employers are required to have their employees complete what?
An I-9 form.
I-9 form, right? I-9 form. However, if somebody completes that I-9 form and actually misstates, right, his or her information, says that he has a social security number, that he's a citizen, or that he or she is authorized, but they're not, right? And I don't know about it, then am I held liable or no? No, right? No. However, if I knew that they were doing that and I hired them, I can't say, oh, well, they told me this, and so I just went based upon the form, right? If you know that they actually are, for whatever reason, that they actually are either making a misstatement on their form, right? You also, again, will run afoul if you subsequently become aware that an employee, after you've hired this person, right, and you didn't know, let's say you didn't know that the person was making a misstatement on his or her form, and then you later find out, let's say one of the employees comes and basically tells you that this person actually lied, or you get some information from the IRS or some other source that tells you this person made a misstatement on their I-9 form, you're obligated to terminate them immediately. If you don't terminate them immediately, then you are also guilty of a violation of the act. In addition, if you don't satisfy, you're also guilty if you don't actually require the form. Can anybody tell me what is the penalty? What is the penalty if a person does not, if the person violates the Immigration Reform and Control Act? Does anybody know?
Yes.
Ms. Lena?
Lena Miller. You need deportation?
The employer. What is the employer? What is the penalty upon employers?
Oh, he would be arrested.
No, I'm not asking if you think. I'm asking if you know.
I don't know that.
And that's a very good point that Ms. Miller made. We're not going to know everything, especially now this is day one of the class. I'm not expecting you to know everything, right? So if I ask you a question you don't know, what is the answer?
I don't know.
You don't know. You don't ever get dinged necessarily for saying I don't know. You will get dinged if you say, something which is is not the correct answer. You know what I mean? So it's best to acknowledge when you don't know. It saves us time because we can move on and maybe come back to you, right? So again, but is there anybody who does know? Morgan?
Okay. Morgan Ray, the book says the employer will be fined $2,200 the first offense, $5,000 the second offense, and $11,000 the third offense.
Exactly. Now, Ms. Miller said criminal sanctions. Do you know why?
Oh, I was going to add on to hers, Jackie Pickering. It's per illegal employee, though.
Right. Per person. But the question I was asking you, Ms. Pickering, is what is, the concept that Ms. Miller suggested in terms of criminal sanctions? How do they come into play?
It says, Jackie Pickering says that pattern knowingly employing illegal immigrants can mean extra fines and up to 6 months in jail for an employer.
Right. So if there's a pattern, if you're a known violator and you've been sanctioned one time, you've been sanctioned twice, and you continue to hire people who are not authorized to work here, then you can be subjected to criminal penalties, right?
Yes.
And they may also be barred from future government contracts. One other thing I forgot to do. What's your name?
Terry, no.
Ms. Newell. Can you give me a time check? Every 5 minutes, let me know what time it is, all right? Because what we're going to do, again, it's now
It's 5:52.
5:02. We're going to, it's 6:30. Gotta have a break. Come back at 6:05. And we're going to do then a review of the venture competition. Right. Okay, so again, if you can give me a 5 minute, every 5 minutes. What time is it now?
5:52.
5:02. Okay, so give it to me on the 5. All right,
You need to give it to you on the 6.
on the 5.
Oh, every 5?
So every set 5:55, and then
Okay.
6 o'clock.
Okay.
No. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So again, what is the agency that's responsible for enforcing the Immigration Reform and Control Act? What is the agency? Yes, ma'am.
Brianna K.O. Sharp, the first management, is it ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement?
Exactly. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, right?
I
ICE.
had a question.
Yes, ma'am.
To go back to, you said illegal, people who are not authorized to be in the United States, does that also revoke their rights, their lawful rights as well? Like, say, for example, if you're supposed to immediately terminate the person who's working there illegally, but then the person gets mad, and of course they can't file for unemployment, but maybe they can get a lawyer and say, well, he knew the whole time that I was illegal. Is there some type of protection against the employer or the company if something like that were to happen? Or does that person even have rights to begin with?
So every person in the United States has some rights. You have a right under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to due process. So you have a right to due process under the Fifth Amendment and to the states, the 14th Amendment. Yes, ma'am.
It's 5:55.
So just let me know. You don't have to raise your hand. Just say
okay.
5:55, and make sure I acknowledge it so I can
Okay.
see every time. Okay. So there are rights. So again, however, and your point that you made is that again, as we said before, if a person knows that you were unauthorized but hires you anyway, right, in order to essentially exploit you, then he or she can be found liable themselves, as we discussed, right? And that happens. And it happens. One reason why it happens. What is one reason why it might happen? Yes, ma'am.
Lena, cheap labor.
Exactly. Cheap labor. You know, and this is one of the things that supposedly President Trump says he's seeking to try to address. A lot of people, again, are out of the workforce because they cannot find work, right? Oftentimes, many people, particularly on the lower end of the employment spectrum, can't find work because people who are not authorized to work here are here working those jobs that these other people should be working, right? And they are working these jobs. One reason is because Ms. Lena pointed out that they're going to be paid less than what a person who would be legally authorized to work that would be paid. So they're going to be paid less than what the federal minimum wage is, per se, or the local minimum wage. Hold on, 1 second. Another reason why they may be hired. What else? What's another reason? What is another reason why they may be hired? Yeah.
Benefits.
Exactly, benefits. So they don't have to perhaps offer the benefits that a person who's legally authorized to work here. What is another reason?
Jackie Pickering, they don't have to not to pay taxes on them, and then also they don't have to apply to the 40-hour-a-week rule.
So again, a whole host of the labor laws that we're going to be talking about in class are not applicable for people who are not authorized to work here. Right? But another reason, though, I will put forth, and this is something that we must acknowledge, and that is people from different parts of the world have different standards for work. In other parts of the world, the ability to have a classroom like this without a bunch of flies around you, for example, or mosquitoes biting at you while you're in your seat, or lights that are not being interrupted, is a luxury. Only the wealthy have the ability to be in a classroom setting like this. Not only a classroom setting, but to have bathrooms like we have. I never realized how wealthy we were until I took a year sabbatical and went over to do some research and some study over in East Africa. And I can tell you that I even went into some of the government offices and the palaces. They didn't have bathrooms that were as nice as the ones you have in this building here. In fact, that nowhere in the country where I was had bathrooms like you had. So again, people who are coming from other parts of the world are at an unfair advantage, actually, than you, because you have been, in some instances, you have been basically kind of comforted. You have been spoiled, is a kind of a lack of a better word. You've been spoiled. So if you bring somebody who, again, when they come into a place like this, they're feeling like they're in heaven, right? And they'll do anything they can to stay in a place, even just like this room. And you who, you've been in rooms like this all the time. This is no big deal to you. You're not going to be as willing to work as hard because, again, you don't have any, context. These people have context, and so, therefore, they're willing to work sometimes 10 times harder, right? Thank you. Than you are. And so, again, that's another thing that some employers take into consideration when hiring people who are unauthorized to work. Yes, Ms. Lane.
Could it be that one of the reasons that immigration and customs could be doing such an excellent job, and that's the reason why they outsource it to the other countries? And this is what I'm saying.
I tell you what, let's take that up later. I want to make sure we hit on the key points. But you raise a question we'll take in consideration, all right? So again, that's what we talked about. Again, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's the agency who's responsible for enforcing the Immigration Reform and Customs Act, all right? But in addition to preventing people from coming here illegally and working, there's also, again, a law that actually is designed to make sure that we're bringing in people. And what's that law called?
No, agree. Terry Noel, Immigration Act of 1990.
Exactly, the Immigration Act. And it creates a limit on the number of people who are allowed to come in each year. And so, again, an employer who wants to hire a person who's not a naturally born citizen or not a citizen who's been naturalized can go through a couple processes. One, they can hire an immigrant who is a permanent resident or who has a valid temporary employment authorization document. Does anybody have one of these, or who has any relatives who has one such document? So you've seen them, right? How do they look?
Oh no, I've never.
No,
seen
I'm talking.
I haven't really seen, I just knew that they had it.
Okay, excellent. Next is to obtain a non-resident labor certification. entitling the person to hire the non-citizen for a permanent full-time position. And in this case, is a form that they're talking about, or certification, is similar to the similar to the H-1B visa program, which is a program that's oftentimes used by people who are in high-skilled labor areas, like the technology sector. And what they say is that there are not enough, for example, engineers, or not enough computer scientists. And so because I couldn't find any computer scientists, I had to go and actually, recruit one from overseas. That's the argument. However, one of the things that President Trump is pointing out, which again, we agree with him on this, and that is that, again, this H-1B program is being abused by the tech sector. There are some, particularly graduates of historically black colleges and universities, who say, well, hey, I have an engineering degree. I've been trying to get a job at Facebook forever. And they're overlooking us. They're not coming to even interview at our schools. But they're going all the way to India, right? Mm-hmm. Which, again, should impose an additional expense. But again, because of the other reasons that we discussed, these are some of the reasons that even bringing on people who are authorized, the companies oftentimes bank on some of those other intangibles, such as, them working harder, or maybe them not, another reason that wasn't raised, but them not complaining, again, about work conditions that we might complain about, right? So these are some of the things that should be taken into consideration. Again, another thing should be taken into consideration, again, is to obtain a temporary non-immigrant visa, which allows a non-citizen to work in the U.S. for 3 to 6 years. So that's one of the things that also can be obtained. And we're going to talk about how, again, visa holders, even non-immigrant visa holders who are from those 7 countries, their visas were suspended. And in fact, people who have those visas, we're going to discuss, are possibly being subjected or are possibly at risk for being, rounded up and deported, which is a really serious issue. All right. So before we go to the actions of the recent actions thank you. And again, we talked about the H2, the O, the L, and the E visas on page 185. And those are the things that you want to also know about. We want to talk about the state immigration legislation. There are laws that have been enacted by states that have added to the restrictions that the federal government has created. So Arizona enacted a law that required law enforcement officials to, identify people who were immigrants and basically traffic stops. So in traffic stops, you could be, basically your contact information not only could, say for example, if you violated a traffic ordinance, they would not only just check and see whether or not you had any previous traffic incidences when they ran your driver's license, but they also will see whether or not you are lawfully authorized to be in the United States. And if you're not, they could essentially apprehend you and then remand you to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement or ICE agency, and then they could begin deportation here. However, the federal government has insisted that the state laws should not be enacted because the federal government has already acted in that area. So they have sought to basically prevent state governments from doing anything related to immigration because they have jurisdiction. The United States federal government has jurisdiction on immigration issues. And however, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the Arizona law that I just mentioned to you was actually lawful. So in Arizona, you actually could, that law that imposed the requirement upon law enforcement officers to check your immigration status is still on the books.
But they have a stipulation, Professor.
Yes, ma'am.
They have a stipulation, looks like that it has to be in conjunction with another violation. So they just can't arbitrarily stop them, but if they stop them for a tail light, speeding, at that same time, they can check with those papers as well.
Right. I think that's what we were alluding to in terms of, but good point. Thank you very much for raising that. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the recent actions that were taken by President Trump. So on Friday, January 27th, as we discussed earlier, last weekend, the administration, the Trump administration, came out with an order that basically said that people who were here in this country from 7 nations, they were, it was addressed to two groups. One were people who were outside of the country, but who were traveling to the United States, who had been issued visas, and who were coming into the United States. So on January 27th, there was about 193 people, 173 people who were traveling. Out of all the thousands of people, 173 people were from these 7 countries who had already been given that stamp by the United States consular in their countries. Because in order to come to the United States, if anybody has been, how many people have been to other countries here, right? So if you want to go to that country, you have to oftentimes go to the embassy, right, from that country and get a stamp on your visa. That will allow you to actually get through to the gate. When you get off the airplane, they'll look, say, who are you? Look at your passport. If you don't have that stamp, they'll send you back on the airplane. You have to go back, or you have to talk to some people in your embassy or their embassy there.
Well, you have to go back on the plane.
And this is what we'll talk about here. So, the stamp that these people had already gotten from the United States Embassy in order to get here, right?
610.
By this executive order that was issued on Friday, the people who left their homes, left their places of origin, some people who are from the United States but were traveling overseas, come back, they said that stamp was declared illegal, or invalid. And so they were basically, as they left the airport, or left not the airport, but as they left the airplane, they were basically, and they came and presented their passport. There was again a screen or a message on the screen that essentially that visa was invalid. They were taken to a room or taken to rooms, and they were basically subjected to additional screening. And so what the administration said they were doing was that they were protecting the nation from foreign terrorists who were entering into the United States, right? But these people had already gotten screened, right? They were either living here in the United States and traveling abroad, or they were abroad and had been given, visas because they were either coming to work, or they were coming to visit, or coming to study, or under one of those other provisions that we talked about earlier. And they were told that they were not eligible to come in, and so they had to actually go to this other screening, or as your colleague alluded, they were put back, or they subjected to being put back on their planes and being sent back home to, or if not sent back home, in fact, if they sought to go and leave, because again, not only do you have to have the visas when you come into the country, you have to have the visas before you get on the plane. So again, the agreements between the United States and other governments is that under treaty obligations, that the governments are required to check, right, to make sure that you have proper visa to get on, to board that plane, right? And so they were being stopped in these countries, right, who, again, have these treaty obligations with the United States, and they were told, well, your visa has been made invalid. And so if you're on a trip, and I've often been like this, I'll spend up to, basically all my money up to the money that I need to get on the plane and get back home sometimes. So you're in this situation, you spent all your money because you're over traveling or visiting or on vacation, and you're trying to get back, then you're told, well, you don't have a valid visa anymore. So you're stuck. You don't even have money to buy a hotel. So recently, I was told that Airbnb actually created a program that anybody who was in that position could actually stay for free in Airbnb, a house, which is, I think, very admirable of Airbnb. So what are these? What is the impact? One, as we said before, that the executive order, Section 3C, suspends entry into the United States as immigrants and non-immigrants for 90 days of people who are citizens from the United States, non-U.S. citizens from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. It also, has, again, subject to certain exceptions, this suspension applies to regardless of the travel origin, type of visa, or U.S. immigration status. It also suspends all refugee admission for 120 days. So again, all people who are seeking, to come to the, United States as refugees, that it is saying that these are suspended for 120 days. However, the refugees from Syria who are coming in to seeking asylum, those are suspended indefinitely, so beyond 120 days if you're coming from Syria. In addition, the executive order says that these bans can be lifted on a case-by-case basis if the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security together have to agree when a person can have their ban lifted. In addition, certain classes, including diplomats, as well as people on NATO business or United Nations business, their visas, the bans on their visas do not apply. All right. Just hold 1 second before let's get to the end of this one before we get questions. In addition, the executive order is drafted so broadly that it can cover not only lawful residents. Be sure to get the 5, Miss 5 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's
No
6:15.
No problem. Not only do not only would the executive order cover those people who are non-permanent residents, but also cover those people who are called permanent residents. What is a person who's called? How do you become a permanent resident if you're not born here in this country? How do you become a permanent resident?
Jason McKenzie, I had to live here for 5 years, and then I went to Virginia to immigration building, and I had to take the test they offered. And they gave me a booklet. I have to learn basically what I learned, most of the stuff I learned in high school about the U.S. They asked me 10 questions, and I had to get 6 out of 10 right to then obtain a citizenship.
So before then, you had what?
I had to live here for 5 years.
So what did you have in order to?
Permanent resident card.
And what was that called?
Green card. A green card.
A green card. It was green in color, right?
Yeah.
It's a green card, right? And so that is what what we were discussing. And what we were saying is that people like Jason, right, before he became a naturalized citizen, and you become a naturalized citizen as a result of you actually, again, passing the test, and you go from becoming an immigrant to a naturalized citizen. That means you now have the right to vote, and you can work, wherever you want. right? You can go to school and have the full rights that other citizens require or have. They're saying that even people like Jason, right, who may be a child, that your status is also, if you come from these countries, your status is also again suspended, right? And you have your visas are revoked. So, but your green card, it may or may not be revoked. And so there's some discussion about that. In fact, there was some confusion, and they said that if you were here on a permanent, you had a green card, but they had some reason to believe that you were a serious threat to public safety, welfare, and public safety and welfare, that you could have again your card revoked. So how do they determine whether or not those cards would be revoked? How did they determine whether or not you were a threat? Does anybody know? Anybody know how they determine whether or not a person who was a green card, a lawful permanent resident of the United States, how they could determine whether they were a threat or not? Yes,
Probably like tearing off. Probably through like the background where they came from, like basically like just what their background was, where they're from.
Well, then again, they know where you're from. So the question is, what questions will they ask?
Probably like something about like how like their criminal background in that country, or like stuff like that. Like how
wasn't even criminal background check, because that's the difference. Because during the campaign, President Trump talked about preventing the criminals from coming in. That was what his big emphasis was. But it wasn't that. They asked questions like, let me see, what is your Facebook account?
Yeah, because you can tell everything from Facebook.
So they said, let me check out your Facebook account. Let me see what statements you've made, either favorable or disfavorable towards the United States, right? So these weren't issues whether or not you were a criminal. These were issues about what type of political ideology you had. And again, we said earlier that the reason why the Trump administration is being sued is because they applied the laws differently based upon what? Religion. Right? So if you were a Christian from one of these 7 countries, or a Jew from one of these 7 countries, right, you weren't subjected to the same type of scrutiny than if you were a Muslim. Right? Yes, ma'am.
Although I think that it's unlawful for them to like go after the religious aspect of it, but I'm just kind of confused on why, when Donald Trump is now in office and now that we're going through the Immigration Act, why did they look at the political aspect more than the criminal background, if that is something that is an issue in our country? If criminals are an issue, if he's so-called like worried about the drug trafficking, why would that not be an initial step to make sure that we see who we allow into our country that way, instead of trying to base it off of religion, even though, we have some Muslims out here that have did stuff to us. However, that doesn't justify the fact that all Muslims are not the same, but criminals are all the same in some aspect.
Well, and your point is well taken, because what is the religious designation of the majority of the people who are in jail?
Sorry, 620.
Thank you. What is the religious belief of the majority of the people who are in jails right now?
Muslims.
African Americans.
You said religious? What'd you say?
So yeah, 2 very misinformed statements, but it's misinformed because they're incorrect. But it's not misinformed because it's based upon the information that he or she, whoever said that, may be getting.
Yeah, because
So the incorrect.
You're asking for religion?
Change it to Muslim.
Excuse me, hold on a second. So I asked, what was the religious belief of the majority of the people in the U.S. jails?
Oh.
And one person said Muslim, and the other person said African American.
I thought you said what kind of people. My bad. I'm sorry. I can answer this.
No, hands down, hands down. But my point is that this is very informative. And very informative because, again, based upon the media, right? Based upon the media's information, the derogatory media information, you may actually believe that. You may actually believe that there's a connection between a person's faith and their criminality.
Yeah.
When the fact is that the vast majority of the people in U.S. jails are Christian.
I was just about to say that.
I mean,
I
the
was
vast
just about to
majority.
say that.
In
Well, I
fact,
guess, yeah, I can understand
What
that.
is
They convert into Muslim.
No,
They're really
what-
Christian in the beginning. Yeah,
well,
you're
no,
right.
I'm saying there are people who are in U.S. jails who are Muslim.
But they saw a lot of people
No.
convert though.
Right,
For why?
But they have a lot of-
We won't. I won't acknowledge what I'm not gonna. But my point is, I'm asking the people who are in jails who have identified what their religious faith is, right? The vast majority of those in U.S. jails, both state jails and federal jails, are Christian.
Yeah, that's true.
However, again, what Trump has said is that he claimed, President Trump claimed that his goal was to try to prevent criminal activity, right? But the majority of the people, again, who in U.S. who is jail, who committed crimes in this country are Christians. But why then would there be a justification to give Christians preference over people who are Muslims? I mean, so again, this is the type of things that the lawyers are again, debating and informing the court right now, and that's the reason why the administration is in court in part. Second of all, before we go to questions, is that the issue of impact on dual citizens. So there are some people who are here in this country who are dual citizens. Does anybody know what a dual citizen is?
Yeah.
Yes.
What is a dual citizen? Who can answer that?
Jason McKenzie.
Mr. McKenzie?
Dual citizen is a person who has citizenship in 2 countries.
Okay.
My godmother, she's a citizen of Trinidad and America.
Exactly. So you can have, again, a citizenship of, have 2 passports, 2 valid passports, a U.S. passport and a Trinidadian passport, as was stated here. However, if you have 2 passports, right? If you have 2 passports, then the executive order also suggests that it could apply to you if one of those passports happens to be one of those from one of those 7 countries. So if you are a person who has a British passport and let's say Iraqi passport, then you could be subjected to the same types of essentially discriminatory treatment that the other people are. However, according to an agreement that the United States had reached with the United Kingdom, anybody who has a United King or a passport from the United Kingdom, as well as one of these other 7 countries, are going to be exempt. Also, a similar announcement was made by the people of Canada that if you have a Canadian passport and you also have a passport from one of these 7 countries, then you're going to be exempt. So again, we see that they're also not only dividing people by where they're from, not only dividing them by again where they're from those 7 countries. Thank you. They're not only dividing them by their religion in those 7 countries, but also whether or not you are you have a dual citizenship from the United Kingdom or Canada. If you have United Kingdom dual citizenship or Canadian citizenship, so even if you're a Muslim, then you're okay, right? But if you have, let's say, a dual citizenship from Jamaica or Trinidad in one of those countries, or Barbados from one of those countries, then you're not okay, right? So again, we see that there's a lot of issue that we can take with this issue. In addition, as was stated before, U.S. citizens, even if they are dual citizens, are not covered, right? The executive order also, if you have gotten a interview to get a a visa from those countries, then you are not, you can go ahead and skip that interview because you're not going to be given one, right? And in addition, they say that essentially there's some reciprocity agreements, and the reciprocity agreements between these countries and the United States, in fact, not just the countries mentioned, but all non-immigrant visa reciprocity agreements should be reviewed. In addition, there was some suggestion that the list of the 7 countries can be added after the 90-day ban. So there were some that suggested that, you know, countries that include Venezuela or maybe Egypt or Pakistan were going to be added. One additional thing. Over the weekend, we know that there were 3 federal courts who blocked implementation of various parts of this executive order. However, the United States government came in court and introduced a memo that basically somehow trumps the court order. So in this, as I said before, this memo states that all people who have visas, who are from these countries, their visas, whether they're immigrant, whether they're here in the United States or outside the United States, those visas are revoked, and they can be subjected to immediate deportation. So this is going to create a huge, huge legal issue that we're going to have to address. But you all, why is it important for business owners? This is the question I'm asking. Why is it important for a person who has a business owner, a business manager, so either a person who's an executive in a business, a person who runs a government agency, or a person who's a manager in any other context? Why is this important? I know, Ms. Lee, your hand has gone up, so you getting your credit for the day. You don't have to, you don't have to raise your hand. But let's see somebody else. Who else? Again, this is what I'll probably be doing. Again, Miss Dobbins. Ms. Dobbins? Ms. Dobbins.
Yeah. As an employer, you don't want to be responsible for hiring someone who is here illegally.
So that's one reason. Mr. Quinn. Miss Quinn.
You also don't want to be, like you said, you don't want to be held liable, and you don't want to be fined as well as have other setbacks because you.
That's kind of similar to what she said. Stay standing. How about you?
6:30.
Thank you, Miss McGriff. Question is, why should you, as a business, either an employer, as an employer, or as a person who is a manager, which is similar to an employer, why should you be interested or in what's happening with these immigration policy changes? Why does it impact you, and what are you required to do?
It impacts you because you want to get a fine or.
Well, that's what she said already.
Get held responsible.
That's what she said already. Give me something else. Help her out. What's your name?
C.R. Gladney.
Miss Gladney.
You could lose potential employees you have already.
That's right, because your employees, stay standing right quick. What she said is that your employees, they could be subjected to this issue, right? So if they're subjected to this, then you want to know, but also you might be recruiting them, people from these countries before, and so because you're recruiting them, that's going to throw your recruitment, so they may impact your employees, all right? You guys can sit. Who else may impact? So one group of people are your employees. What is the other group that might be impacted as a business owner?
It will affect your future recruitment or the people you want to hire.
Well, we talked about that. So your potential employees or your current employees. What other group?
There's
Your customers. Stay standing. Exactly. Your customers, right? So if you are a business, let's say if you are a travel agency, for example, right? And you got people coming from, Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Somalia, Syria. Who else is on the list? Syria. We already said Yemen, Libya, right? You got people coming from those countries who are, or you were an airline agent, an airline company, right? They're going to say, hey, well, I need a refund. So they're going to impact you. So again, the second group are customers, right? You're going to be particularly concerned and pissed off, right? Because you're about to lose money, right? What's the other class of people?
Brianna Kale Sharp, the first investors.
Investors, absolutely. Your investors, say for example, you got somebody from Iraq or Libya, you can have a seat, who has invested millions of dollars. And they oftentimes come over to check on their investment like once a year. Or if they don't even come over, they just want to know that they have the ability to come over and check. And now, because of this order, they can't come over. What are they likely to do? Actually, to ask for their money. Right? So you're about to, again, lose investors. So these are the types of, and also your partners. So the people, let's say, for example, if you have, let's say you make the iPhone, we know the iPhone, a substantial part of the iPhone is made where? In China, right? Let's say, for example, that we had parts that are being made in one of these countries. Because, as we know, this is kind of a global economy. So it might be, your contract might be, for a Chinese company to make it, but they might have factories, let's say, in Sudan or Libya, right? Or Somalia. And so they have a factory there. So imagine that now, you have an issue of transporting your goods. So again, they send somebody over with the parts when they come over, and now that person can't get in. So there's an issue of how we're going to be able to address commerce. So all these, so we can see that this action, even though it's supposedly targeting, they said, thank you. They said that even though it's only targeting, I think at least 100 million people supposedly are impacted by this. And even if you say, well, I'm not one of those 100 million. I'm not from any of these countries. I don't know anybody from these countries. You can now see that it could actually still have an impact on all of us, right? So these are the types of things that we need to be aware of as managers. And what time did you say it was?
6:35.
6:35. Okay.
So we should just up the venture to 6:50.
No, I'm not finished yet. All right. So again, now what we're going to do is talk about. We're going to segue into the first part of the chapter, and that is the part of the chapter that talks about employment law and the types of employment. So we've been talking a lot about you all as potential employers. So tell me, what are the various types of employments that you can enjoy here? Ms. Sogvison, what are the types of employment opportunities, the different types of statuses as employees? What is one status? Ms. Sogvison? What are the types of working statuses that you can enjoy here in the United States?
The benefits.
Miss Turner, help her out.
Self-employment.
Is self-employment, you are called a what?
Sole proprietor.
An independent contractor, exactly. That's one. Thank you. You can have a seat. As can you, Ms. Sakusa. What's the other type, Mr. Jackson?
Was it? I don't know. I would say. I was thinking that I don't know.
In addition to being an independent contractor, you can also be what, Mr. Payne?
If you're not somebody that is an entrepreneur or owns their own company, you could also be.
All right. And what are the two types of classes of employment? At will employment, thank you. And also, Miss Power.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay, all right. Stay standing. Mr. Young.
What was the first one?
At will.
How are you not able to, I guess you'd be like the military, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Military wouldn't be at will employment, right?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. The military is a, you can be discharged at will, but there are other type of, so I would, although you do also sign a contract. And so the basically what I'm saying is that the other, I've kind of alluded to what that is. So you have an at-will employee, a person who has no contract, and a person who has a contract, which is called a what? What? A contract employee. Thank you. So either a will employee and a contract employee. Now the differences between an at-will employee and a contract employee, as was talked about before, that absent a contrary agreement or law, an employer may terminate an employee at any time or for any reason or for no reason at all. This is something you need to remember. However, you can't terminate an employee for what?
Race or gender?
You can.
Jackie Pickering, race or gender? Or religion?
And the list is more expansive than that. But you can't terminate an employee for a bad reason. So always remember this. So if a person is working for you and you don't have enough money to pay that person anymore, right? You can terminate that person, right? If the person is not doing a good job, you can terminate that person. If you are there's no longer customers for the position that is being supported, or that there's no longer customers that is supporting that position, you can terminate that person. If you just say, well, I just don't want to have you working here anymore. Now, I don't like you. Just because I don't like people whose name are Pickering. I don't like people whose names are Pickering, right? So I want to terminate all employees whose names are Pickering from my job. I mean my company. However, you cannot terminate a person if they have again a issue. Let's say you have an issue with them based upon their race, their national origin, their religion, or other one of these protected classes that we're going to talk about. So that's the thing that you got to always remember, right? Yeah. So that, again, there are exceptions to this idea, and that is one of the exceptions. Again, that if there's an implied contract. So again, even when there's no written contract, there are sometimes considered to be a implied contract. That's when, again, there's either no stated contract, but based upon the kind of common custom of that employer and those types of employees, there can be a contract that is implied. Also, if you discharge somebody in an abusive way, right? So let's say, for example, if you have a person who works for you and you terminate them for a lawful reason, but then you take their you box up all their goods, you call them to your office, you box up all while they're in your office, you have somebody go into their office, box up all their stuff, put it into a box, and then you take it out, of your office, you have it brought up to your office on the 18th floor and say you're fired. And in fact, you open your window, you throw that stuff out the window, right, onto the street and say, now you get your stuff, you can get out of here. That might be considered abusive discharge, right, and subject you to a claim of even emotional distress, right? So there's some issues that you have to also be worried about. Another issue that you have to be worried about is if you are terminating somebody because they are not going to do something that is illegal. So, for example, if you say, I want you to basically, fudge the numbers here on this, spreadsheet. We are, we're at a loss. We're realizing a loss, but I don't want my stockholders, or I don't want the government, who I'm responsible for accounting, the numbers to know that we are, experiencing a loss. So I want you to fudge those numbers. If you say no, and they fire you, you can again sue them based upon, again, a violation of public policy. Also, if, for example, you see that your company is, as I said, they say defrauding the federal government or the state government, millions of dollars, for example, right? And then you report that. You can then, and if you're fired, you can then sue the person for termination based upon violation of various whistleblower protections. All right? So those are some of the things that a employer has to also be on the lookout for. So I know it's now 6:45, or almost 6:45, so we'll go ahead and take a break here. We'll finish up the wage and hour laws, the federal